In this episode, we are going to sort out 4 role labels that sound simple at first, but become very important once an organization starts using artificial intelligence, AI, in serious ways. Those 4 labels are developers, providers, deployers, and users, and they matter because governance depends on knowing who is doing what at each stage of the system's life. New learners often hear these words used loosely and come away with the impression that they all point to the same general idea of people involved with AI. That loose approach creates confusion very quickly, because building a system is not the same as offering it. Offering it is not the same as putting it into operation for a real purpose, and using it is not the same as deciding how it should be governed. If you can hear these 4 roles and immediately understand where each one fits, later topics like accountability, third-party risk, oversight, transparency, and lifecycle governance become much easier to follow. The goal here is not to memorize labels in isolation, but to understand how responsibility travels from creation to real-world use. Once you see that chain clearly, the whole governance model becomes more practical and much less abstract. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to begin is by treating these labels as descriptions of functions rather than as permanent identities. One company can play more than one role at the same time, and one role can involve many people with different job titles underneath it. A software company may build an AI tool for others, which puts it close to the developer and provider side. But that same company may also use the tool internally for its own business operations, which puts it in the deployer and user side as well. A bank might buy a tool from a vendor instead of building it, which means the bank is not the original developer, but the bank still becomes deeply important once it decides how that tool will be used on real customers or employees. A worker using the tool day to day may have a very different kind of responsibility from the leader who approved the deployment, even though both are interacting with the same system. These labels therefore help you answer a more disciplined question. Instead of asking who touched the tool in a vague way, governance asks who built it, who made it available, who decided to use it in a real setting, and who is relying on it in practice. The developer role usually sits closest to creation. Developers are the people or organizations involved in designing, building, adapting, training, testing, refining, or otherwise shaping how an AI system behaves before it is used in a real-world setting. This can include selecting model approaches, preparing data, tuning performance, evaluating results, defining boundaries, and documenting known limitations. In simple terms, developers help determine what the system can do, what inputs it expects, how it produces outputs, and where it may be strong or weak. That makes the developer role important because many later governance questions begin with choices made here. If the wrong problem is framed, if the data is poor, if the testing is narrow, or if known weaknesses are hidden or poorly explained, those weaknesses may travel forward into every later stage. A beginner should understand that developers do not only write code. They shape the technical behavior and assumptions of the system, and that influence can affect fairness, safety, privacy, reliability, and downstream accountability long before deployment ever begins. Even though developers are central, one common beginner mistake is to assume they own every governance decision just because they understand the system most deeply. That is not how responsible governance works. A developer may know how the system was built and where it may break, but that does not automatically mean the developer should decide whether the system is appropriate for hiring, credit review, healthcare support, fraud action, or any other higher stakes setting. Those later decisions require business judgment, legal awareness, privacy review, and operational context that go beyond pure technical design. Developers should communicate limitations clearly, validate performance honestly, and document the conditions under which the system should or should not be trusted. They also need to help others understand what the system was built for and what it was not built for. But governance becomes unbalanced when an organization places every later question on the developer alone. The better mental model is that developers create and shape capability, while other roles help determine whether that capability should be offered, deployed, constrained, or relied upon in real use. The provider role comes next, and this one can be harder to grasp because it sits between creation and real-world use. A provider is generally the person or organization that makes the AI capability available as a product, service, platform, or offering under its own name or responsibility. Sometimes the provider is also the original developer, but not always. A company may build a model internally and then sell access to it, which means it is both developer and provider. Another company may take models or technical components developed elsewhere, package them into a service, brand that service as its own, and make it available to customers. In that second case, the provider may not have built every technical layer from scratch, yet it still occupies a major governance role because it is the entity putting the system into the market or into wider use. This matters because the provider helps define intended use, customer expectations, documentation, limitations, integration options, and the promises or representations that surround the system. Providers therefore shape how others understand and adopt the tool, not just how the tool functions technically. From a governance point of view, providers carry a responsibility to be clear, realistic, and disciplined about what they are offering. If a provider overstates reliability, hides important limitations, makes vague claims about fairness, or encourages use far beyond what the system can support safely, the downstream governance burden becomes much harder for everyone else. Providers are often the source of documentation, acceptable use conditions, implementation guidance, performance descriptions, and sometimes the mechanisms for monitoring or updating the system after release. That means providers influence whether deployers can make informed decisions or whether they are left relying on marketing language and incomplete assumptions. A useful way to think about the provider role is that it packages capability for others to adopt. The provider is not merely the maker behind the curtain. It is the party that presents the system to the next stage of the life cycle and helps shape how that next stage understands what the system is for. In many real-world situations, the provider becomes the main reference point that others depend on when deciding whether and how to trust the tool. The deployer role is where governance becomes especially concrete, because the deployer is the actor that decides to put the AI system into operation for a real purpose in a real context. A deployer does not just admire the technology or evaluate it in theory. The deployer uses it to support or influence actual business activity, actual decisions, or actual interactions with people. This is a crucial distinction because many of the most important governance duties emerge only when the system meets real data, real users, and real consequences. A company that buys a vendor tool for internal document summarization becomes a deployer once it activates and integrates that tool for its workforce. A hospital that introduces an AI support system into clinical workflows becomes a deployer when it decides where the system is allowed to assist and what review is required. A retailer that uses a recommendation engine or customer support bot is acting as a deployer when it chooses how that tool operates inside its own services. The deployer, in other words, is the one that turns capability into actual organizational use. That deployer role matters enormously because even a well-built system can create harm if it is deployed in the wrong setting, for the wrong purpose, with the wrong data, or with the wrong level of human oversight. Deployers decide whether the tool fits the context, whether the risks are acceptable, whether users need training, whether people affected by the system need notice or explanation, and whether monitoring is strong enough to catch problems after launch. A deployer cannot simply point to the vendor or original builder and say the responsibility ended there. Once an organization decides to rely on a system within its own operations, it takes on governance duties of its own. It must ask whether the system should be used at all, whether the use case has changed since the system was originally described, whether the inputs remain appropriate, and whether the outputs are being used more heavily than intended. The deployer role is therefore where accountability becomes deeply connected to context. It is not only about what the system can do. It is about whether this organization should use it this way, under these conditions, with these people affected. The user role may sound the simplest, but it can be surprisingly important because users are the people who interact with the system during everyday operation. Sometimes that means employees using the AI tool as part of their work. Sometimes it means customers, applicants, patients, or members of the public who interact with the system directly or are affected by outputs generated through it. Users matter because no system exists only on paper. At some point, someone relies on the output, responds to the recommendation, enters data, accepts a suggestion, or experiences the consequences of automated behavior. A beginner should avoid thinking of users as passive figures at the end of the chain. They are often the point where overtrust, misunderstanding, misuse, or hidden burden appears. If users assume the system is more accurate than it really is, they may stop exercising judgment. If users do not understand what the system is doing, they may not know when to challenge it. If people affected by the system do not realize AI is involved, they may lose a meaningful chance to question or appeal its influence. Governance, therefore, has to take user behavior seriously, not just developer skill and deployer intent. A tool can be technically strong and still be used poorly if users are not trained, if the interface encourages blind acceptance, or if the workflow gives users no real ability to notice when something has gone wrong. An employee reviewing AI-generated recommendations needs enough context, time, and authority to challenge the output rather than simply approve it. A customer-facing user may need basic notice that the interaction involves automation and may need a route to human support when the tool fails or creates confusion. Internal users also carry responsibilities of their own, such as following acceptable use rules, protecting sensitive information, and recognizing when a system's output should not be trusted without further review. The user role is different from the deployer role because users do not necessarily choose the governance model or approve the use case, but their conduct still affects whether the system operates safely and responsibly. When organizations ignore users, they often discover too late that the final layer of human judgment was weaker than they assumed. A concrete example can make these distinctions easier to hear. Imagine a company that offers an AI tool to help employers screen job applications. One group designs the model, prepares the training data, tests performance, and refines the scoring logic. That group is acting in the developer role because it is shaping how the system functions. The company that packages the tool, brands it, documents it, sells it to employers, and explains what it is supposed to do is acting in the provider role. An employer that buys the tool and decides to use it in its own hiring workflow is acting in the deployer role because it is choosing to apply the system in a real business context with real people affected. The recruiter or hiring manager who relies on the system's output during day-to-day screening is acting in the user role. Once you hear the story this way, the role boundaries start to become much clearer, and you can also see how each role introduces different governance responsibilities without collapsing everything into one vague idea of participation. This example also shows why accountability cannot be assigned sensibly unless the roles are separated first. If job applicants are treated unfairly, the cause may not rest in only one place. The developer may have trained the system poorly or tested it too narrowly. The provider may have described the tool too confidently or failed to explain important limitations. The deployer may have placed the system into a hiring process without proper review, without sufficient human oversight, or in a context the tool was never meant to handle. The user may have relied too heavily on the score and stopped exercising independent judgment. Governance improves when an organization can trace these layers clearly rather than asking only who touched the tool most recently. It also helps avoid another common problem, which is letting each party assume the others handled the hard questions. Once the roles are clear, it becomes easier to decide who must document what, who must train who must review which risks, and who must respond when the real-world use begins to drift away from the original assumptions. Another important lesson is that one organization can occupy several of these roles at once, and that overlap is where many students become uncertain. A company may develop an internal AI tool for its own employees. In that case, it is building the system, making it available internally, deciding how it will be used, and then having staff interact with it in practice. That means the same organization may contain developer, provider, deployer, and user roles all under one roof. The fact that the organization is the same does not erase the differences between those roles. It simply means the governance model has to separate them conceptually so that responsibilities do not collapse together. A team that built the tool should not automatically approve its use for every purpose. A business unit that wants to deploy it should not assume internal availability means all governance review is complete. Staff who use it should not assume that because the tool came from inside the company, it must be safe to trust without question. Overlap makes governance more complicated, which is exactly why the role labels are useful. Beginners also need to watch for a few common misconceptions. One is the idea that the provider always carries all the responsibility because it offered the tool first. That is not enough once another organization chooses to deploy the system in its own environment for its own goals. Another misconception is that the developer is always the main decision maker because the developer understands the technical details. Technical understanding matters, but governance includes legal, ethical, operational, and organizational judgments that extend beyond the build stage. A third misconception is that users have no real governance role because they are only following the workflow placed in front of them. In reality, user behavior can make a safe system less safe or make a questionable system more damaging through over-reliance, misuse, or failure to escalate concerns. Yet another misconception is that once one role is well governed, the others matter less. Responsible AI governance does not work like that. Weakness at any one stage can affect everything that follows, because the life cycle is connected even when the roles are distinct. A strong practical habit is to ask 4 simple questions whenever you hear about an AI system. Who shaped the system and its behavior? Who made it available for others to adopt or rely on? Who decided to put it into operation in this actual context? Who is using it or being affected by it during everyday activity? Those questions do not solve every governance issue by themselves, but they help you place the issue in the right part of the chain. They also make later topics like contracts, assessments, documentation, human oversight, and incident response easier to understand because those topics rarely belong equally to every role. Some responsibilities sit closer to development, some to provision, some to deployment, and some to use. When you can separate those stages mentally, the whole governance model becomes less blurry. Instead of thinking of AI as one big object with one owner, you begin to see a sequence of roles, each with its own decisions, its own responsibilities, and its own opportunities to reduce or increase harm. As you finish this lesson, keep one mental picture in mind. Developers shape the system, providers make the system available, deployers choose how the system will operate in a real setting, and users interact with the system or its effects in everyday practice. Those roles may overlap inside one organization or stretch across several organizations, but they should never be treated as interchangeable. Governance depends on separating them clearly enough that accountability, review, transparency, and oversight can be assigned where they actually belong. When those distinctions are ignored, responsibility becomes muddy and problems become harder to trace or prevent. When those distinctions are understood, the organization is in a much better position to ask the right questions at the right stage and to build a governance model that follows the system from its creation all the way to its real-world impact. That clarity is exactly why these 4 roles matter so much in AI governance.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.